Every so often you meet someone whose life is so remarkable and whose love and determination in saving nature leaves you in awe. I think of the campaigner Alex Morton from Season 1, who's been responsible for getting the open pen salmon farm shut down in British Columbia, or the late Jane Goodall, the renowned primatologist and conservationist. This week's guest on The Last Salmon is someone who has spent their life in the cause of salmon conservation, and who has been at the forefront of creating salmon strongholds across the Russian Far East and in the Pacific Northwest. Guido Rahr is president and CEO of the Wild Salmon Centre in Portland, Oregon. And I speak to Guido about the concept and strategy of creating salmon strongholds and finding out what lessons we can learn for the Atlantic salmon in the process.
I come from a family of fly fishers. My grandfather and my aunts and uncles, they all fished. That's what they did during the day. We had cabins on this river called the Deschutes in Oregon, which is a big, cold, fast, deep river that flows through the desert, kind of rimrock and juniper and sagebrush country of Central Oregon. And it's famous for its race of big rainbow trout. And so I learned how to fly fish for trout. And then the mysteries of steelhead kind of entered my world. And my cousins and grandparents and so on would speak reverently of steelhead. Now, a steelhead is a type of rainbow trout that goes to the ocean, but they're all members of the salmonid family. So a steelhead is a salmon. It's got a little bit of a different name. So I heard about these big, wild, beautiful, powerful, kind of mysterious fish that showed up in the fall on our river, the Deschutes. And there was a long time between my aspirations to catch one and finally catching one. And that opened up a window into a whole group of unbelievable species.
Tell us a bit about those species that it opened up.
There's the family Salmonidae, which has the Atlantic salmon. It has all the char, has rainbow trout, the chum, pink, coho, sockeye, Asian masu salmon, and the taimen. And cold water fisheries for salmonid fish is probably the most ancient and with the most passionate following of any. I can't think of any outdoor pursuit with as much literature and completely, grabbing a hold of the human species that there is. I mean, there's been shelves of books written about cold water fishing for salmon and trout. But salmon have their own mystery and power that is hard to describe. But, for me, when I'm in a river fishing, which is my natural habitat, one of my natural habitats, and a salmon swims by me in the river, and I look down and I see that fish, that means that river and me are connected to the entire North Pacific ecosystem. And that fish moving from that great expanse of ocean into this river, and this river is very much like a living, breathing thing, right?
Yeah.
It's like your arm or your leg to the planet, to the ocean. Mm-hmm. And it's one integrated system. And when that salmon goes by you and far up on his way up to the headwaters to spawn and die, it means you are connected to that river, and that river is connected ecologically to the great North Pacific, and you're all part of something that is so fundamental to who we are as a species. It's a very powerful thing. So among the different types of salmon, right, I'm not an Atlantic salmon guy, I'm a Pacific salmon guy. Each one of those species has their own stories and their own, milieu, their own environment, and all different techniques. And each river and each species is a whole portal into a different world. And taking those apart and learning how to fish for Chinook or coho or steelhead and owning and loving that river where they are found is, there are just dozens of little surprises and windows that open up, and you learn about the geology and the biological diversity and the fish and the traditions. And so it becomes completely engrossing. That's probably a longer response than you were looking for to a very good question.
It's absolutely beautiful listening to you describe the connection that the salmon give you to the rest of nature, the whole of the Pacific ecosystem. I think you said it's wonderful. I've always thought, and I'm not alone, I don't think, because being an Atlantic salmon angler just by virtue of where I'm from, that people like yourself, salmon anglers from the Pacific side of the world, are spoiled because you have 5 different species to choose from. And sometimes in some of those rivers, am I right, all 5 species run?
Yeah.
I mean, I think the odds are stacked against the Atlantic salmon angler if we are to pit ourselves against each other. Which one, if you had to choose, which one would you prefer to fish for? Fly fish.
I mean, it's going to be the steelhead. They're just
The
so,
Steelies.
yeah. I mean, so to be fair, again, the Atlantic salmon that I've caught and the Atlantic salmon that I understand, they really are, I'm not going to say the pinnacle, but they are right at the peak with steelhead because Atlantic salmon are powerful, almost as powerful as a steelhead. That can be debated. I know, see, I tease my Atlantic salmon friends about which pull harder, steelhead or Atlantic, and we debate this, so I don't mean to be provocative with that. But so Atlantic salmon are more surface oriented and we'll take them in the top of the water column and spend a lot of time kind of refusing and returning to the fly. I've never seen that with any Pacific salmon. So you've got a big, beautiful fish that will take a skating fly or in the top of the water column on a swing, right, in beautiful rivers. You know, that's pretty unusual in the world of salmon. Now, steelhead will do that, but only certain parts of the run and only certain races of fish. Winter steelhead won't do that. So, but steelhead are incredibly strong. And in the ocean, they're the furthest traveler too. So we have steelhead that spawn in the Snake River of Oregon that have been collected by Russian scientists accidentally off the coast of Kamchatka. So those fish were rearing across the Pacific Ocean off the coast of the Russian Far East and then returning to the Snake River, which is just crazy.
Just give us give context on that distance for those that aren't familiar with that part of the world. Roughly how many thousands of miles
I think
do you think
there's
that
4,000 miles across the Pacific Ocean.
That's insane, isn't it?
Yeah. Steelhead have a special place in the Western fly fishing culture and species. Coho have their own special thing. They're very surface oriented, but they're it's a very narrow window that you can get them, but you'll get them on surface flies, and they're beautiful fish. Chum, never on the surface. You're always swinging deep. They're incredibly strong fish. Rarely jump. Coho will jump like crazy. And that finally, I want to say Chinook, which are a particular passion of mine, or king salmon, are very depth focused. You've got to be at exactly their level in the water column, but they're huge and incredibly strong.
And you've caught them all, you bastard. You lucky bastard. Good for you. Well, that was a brief and very, very useful, I think, how-to on which of the Pacific and indeed which any of the salmon species, how to catch them and where to catch them. I wasn't aware that there was an obvious line between the depth of where these fish take. And I knew the Atlantics, obviously, depending on water temperature and a myriad of other things, are quite unique in as much as they will come up for the fly, and you can obviously catch them on the dry fly in certain parts of the world. But I didn't realize that they were quite that specific in that particular way they took. So that's interesting.
Well, I'll say that summer steelhead, there's two races, winter steelhead and summer steelhead. Summer steelhead are just like an Atlantic salmon that comes in the summer or fall, but instead of spawning in the fall, all steelhead spawn the next spring, the spring following their arrival. But the summer steelhead are very surface oriented and take dry flies and are very exciting. And and coho are very surface oriented, to be clear. Chinook, chum, pink, Asian masu, they want to be deeper in the water column. But Atlantic salmon will go all the way through the water column to take flies. It's just amazing.
That's why we love them.
Yeah.
That's why we think they're special. I'm going to take you back, if that's all right, Guido. I'm going to take you back to your roots a little bit because I've read your book, as many have, and you talk a lot about your childhood and this sort of sense of isolation and this, I suppose, would I be wrong in saying that you felt closer to nature than you did the human race, if we can split the two up like that? And reptiles in particular were your thing. Is that right?
Yeah. I was a serious reptile collector from the age of like 7 to all the way through my 20s. And it connected me with nature in a very fundamental way early in my life. And that's never gone away. I'm the oldest of 5 kids, grew up out in the country outside of Portland, Oregon, in the Pacific Northwest of the United States. And it was kind of oak grassland, patches of oak, madrona, occasional Doug fir. And I just started collecting, reptiles and amphibians and just spending my days kind of getting out of the chaos of my home and looking under rocks and logs and walking slowly and looking with all my powers to find these little gems. And it is so hard to find a northern alligator lizard or a Pacific giant salamander or a rubber boa or any of these species. It's like fishing, but really hard. I turned over thousands of rocks as a little boy, wandering and I would disappear in the morning and come back, and my parents were totally cool with that. But it was for me like Christmas morning, every day in the woods, opening presents and seeing these beautiful and you know, mysterious and elusive animals, and then trying to understand what is going on. And then each one is a portal, right, to its ecosystem and its
Yeah.
world. So there's endless little discoveries. And I was not very social in school, and I didn't go to the soccer games or play on a team, and that was okay with me. And I wasn't unhappy or I wasn't insecure. I just was deeply fulfilled, in nature. But I did have learning disabilities growing up at school, and eventually my mom decided to give me a copy of Raymond Dittmar's Reptiles of North America, which was a big, thick book, and I was probably 9 years old, and I took that book and I read it as a scientific book, cover to cover. I memorized the Latin names, you know, at the genus and species level for all the North American reptiles, actually most of the Mexican ones too, and I down to the species level. And I still remember those. And it's interesting, that looking back at it, I've never had trouble with languages or words or writing, and my dyslexia. I mentioned to you before, it's like put fires together, wires together. And
Yeah.
that book and those reptiles and those names, Lampropeltis zonata and Dicamptodon insatus and Plethodon, all these beautiful, strange things wired my brain in a way that's been helpful. Now, of course, I'm wildly deficient in other areas, I'm sure, but this was helpful for me. And I kept collecting, and I collected all over the North American tropics, collected boas from the Caribbean. I ended up collecting all the way down into Costa Rica, poisonous snakes, non-poisonous snakes. And my parents were totally cool with it. It was amazing. I had cages in my room. So that's what I did.
How did you get from that insular, introspective, reptile-loving little boy to this big voice in the world of conservation?
Well, there were a lot of twists and turns, but when I was in I was out of college, living in Portland. My cousin Spencer Beebe was working for the Nature Conservancy of Oregon and said, we need somebody down in Southwest Mexico, down in the state of Chiapas, which, if you're looking at a map of Mexico, was the very southwest corner of Mexico on the edge of Guatemala, and a place that has no cultural or biological resemblance to where we are up here. I mean, it's a really interesting landscape of incredibly ancient culture and incredibly rich biological diversity. I'm expounding upon Chiapas, but it's a place where you still have the ancient Mayans living in their traditional dress, the Zeltal and the Tzotzil, and other groups of this is the southern mountains of Mexico on the Guatemala border. These are the ancestors of the Maya, but also incredibly rich biological diversity. Anyway, Spencer said we need somebody down there. The Mexicans are trying to protect the last cloud forest of the mountain range along the Pacific called the Sierra Madre del Sur. And so I went down there, and the day I arrived, it was 116 degrees in Tuxtla Gutierrez, Chiapas. And it was suffocatingly hot. But we met, and it was part of a planning process to help Mexico set aside. And so, for context, Mexico was burning every dry season. The Mexican farmers are burning primary forest to make room for agricultural crops. It had gone and basically wiped out most of these forests, but just on the tops of some of the mountains were islands of cloud forest. And so cloud forest is misty, and wet and dripping and cool and home to orchids and bromeliads and all these things. So I worked with the Mexicans on setting up protected areas for the cloud forest and supporting that. That's how I got started.
So tell us a little bit more about that. I know there's a story in there about the cloud forest, which showcased the importance of bringing different people together for a conservation cause. Could you just tell us a little bit about that story? It never gets old.
So I worked in Mexico, and it was really the issue of conservation was very real for me because each one of these mountain ranges in Chiapas had its own species, like islands of very interesting reptiles and birds. There was the famous Quetzalcoatl, which is a trogon, member of the trogon family, but it's considered the most beautiful bird in the tropics by some, worshipped by the Aztecs. This is a bird that has long, trailing, iridescent green and blue feathers and this amazing crest, and they're just, it's like a deity. It's incredible. There are, orchids, bromeliads, beautiful butterflies. There are lizards called like you can call them arboreal alligator lizards. There's no good English name for them, but they're brilliantly colored green, blue, checkered little horns, just like something out of a cartoon. And they live among the orchids. They're completely harmless and just totally wild looking. And each time that fire line of burning those forests crests the mountain, you could be losing entire species that for millions of years have been isolated in these little mountaintop cloud forests. And during the Pleistocene glaciations, that band would go up and down based on the climate change. So it was very real, the extinction crisis of central Mesoamerica for me. And that's motivating as a conservationist. So I ended up being promoted and ended up working in Mexico City and then went to Washington, D.C. And then they wanted me to really double down on fundraising because that's what we needed is to put money into it. And the Mexican partners needed financial support to create these parks and protected areas. So the pressure was on for me to raise money. And this is an important part of learning how to do the craft of conservation is you need to learn how to raise money, not government money, not just foundation money, but money that comes from relationships with people that have it. And we were taught the number one thing that I learned is if you can find someone that has the ability to help you and you can get them to that forest or that place and frankly, that river, and they can feel that and see that, there's no substitute for that experience. You could go and have lunch with them for 10 years every week in New York City, and it wouldn't be the same thing. The second thing that happens is they know you with your strengths and weaknesses and your integrity and credibility. That's not something you spend a week with somebody in the wilds. It's pretty clear who you are and who you're not. And that creates relationships that last for a long time. So basically, my first breakthrough was Sam and Susie Bell. That's General Mills funding, old Minnesota family. Sam was living in Vero Beach, Florida, spending a lot of time, on bird hunting and polo and horses and with a pretty Tony set down there. And I got Sam on the phone and said, Sam, you've got to come with me to the Mexican cloud forests and see the quetzal and the orchids and the bromeliads and the morpho butterflies and the sun shining on the mist. And he's like, wow, that sounds great. Can I bring some friends? And I said, yes, absolutely. Bring some friends and bring Susie. So he brought some of his kind of polo friends and, from Vero Beach, Florida. And I honestly didn't dwell on the fact that it was a 3-day 5,000-mile climb to get from the thorn forest or up into the cloud forest. And that's on me. But Sam, everybody showed up in Chiapas. It was baking hot, 5 hours to the dry deciduous forest. And they were loaded with bags and booze. I mean, duffel bags of cocktail materials, everything. They were ready for a stroll through the cloud forest. It was a little bit more arduous than they were expecting. I mean, I did tell them we had a hike to get in there, but not quite at that gradient. And that first night, when my Mexican colleagues were pretty darn sure this was going to be the end of my career, they all drank and partied. And at one point, they were going to sit on this log by the forest. And anyone that collects things in the wilds knows that loose bark on a log, you should always look under that because that's great habitat. And sure enough, I lifted this piece when they weren't looking, and a great big scorpion just crawls off into the. And I said, well, let's find you a safe place to sit. But they all drank and swam that night and had a great time. And my Mexican friends were like, Guido, this is not a good situation. because this is dangerous and wild territory, and we are completely isolated now. The next day, everybody woke up and they were just completely hungover and started the long, arduous climb up. And we had horses, but there were these kind of skinny Mexican horses. And so we had to load the booze on the horses, but all the gringos had to walk. Anyway, it was this long walk, and you go up through the dry forest, and then you go into the tropical rainforest, and things cool down a little bit, and you finally zigzag your way up the mountainside. And that first night was brutal. We didn't make it to our camping area, so we had to camp kind of on the side of a hill, cut some little trees down, and it was kind of pokey, and they were extremely unhappy. And I was summoned into the tent of Sam, and not Sam was very, I wouldn't say amused, but more willing to rock and roll. The rest of them were like, we Guido, this has been great, but we're going to go back down now. And I said, you can't. There's no way to communicate with the outside world. There's nobody down there to meet us. We cannot go back. And this escalated until finally people were resigned to this fact that we had to keep going up. And we went up and up. And as we climbed up, it started to become, it's just beautiful. I mean, there's no other way to put it. It's just like, I don't know, Narnia or something with just these ancient big trees. And the place is alive with birds and all kinds of wildlife. And then we eventually got up into the cloud forest, which is this mystical place. And they started to look around and see things. And all this tension started to dissipate. And it became a remarkable experience for all of them. And I think the hardship of getting up there really made it sweet, to experience it. And I literally thought my career was going to have to shift after that. I thought it was, major donor fundraising, maybe not my thing. But an amazing thing happened, and the gringos and the Mexicans had kind of been a little standoffish with each other. And these are wonderful Mexican colleagues, highly educated biologists and stuff who were just patient and wonderful with me. And one night, I'll just finish, there was that last night, there was a downpour, and they saw quetzals, morphos, all kinds of species. And the last night, a pouring rain came down, just one of these tropical things just pounding down, and everybody went into their tents. And then it stopped, and there was that dead quiet after the storm. And the Mexicans were sitting around the fire singing beautifully in Spanish. And then one tent after another, the zippers came down, and the American guests came and sat down with them and started to sing with them. And it was just this little moment where we all really were under the same tent. And then on the way back down, nobody was horribly ill, but there were some close calls. Susie Bell came into my tent one morning saying, Guido, my tongue has turned completely black. We finally figured out it was from the iodine they were using to purify the water. But little things like this were happening a lot. Anyway, on the way back down, I said, Sam, would you consider supporting this work? And he looked at me and said, Guido, I think we can work this out. And Sam Bell and Susie have been dear friends, and they've been funding us every single year since then, over the years.
Take the people that you want to back you, you want to support you. If it's a conservation cause, you take them on the journey. You have to show them what you're asking them to support. And if it's a worthwhile cause or something as beautiful and as natural and as halcyon as that, they've got no choice but to support it, right? To show them, open their eyes to the beauty of the world. And I think that's a neat segue into another Eden, the Kamchatka over in Russia. Just describe, if you can, give us a little bit of context on the Kamchatka and its beauty and what its relevance is to salmon in particular.
Well, I mean, for me, going to Kamchatka and also the Russian Far East, Primoria and Khabarovsky Krai, was one of the most incredible experiences of my life. So this was the early 1990s, and I was just wrapping up my tropical forest work, and I went back to grad school. And about that time, the Soviet Union really broke up in this was the early 90s, late 80s. And the doors opened, and we raced over to Mongolia to do exploratory trips. This had just happened. It was safe to travel over there. Kamchatka was a protected military zone in Russia where even Russian travel was restricted because of their nuclear submarine base. So before I describe this, let me just describe the geography. So if you look at a map of the Pacific Rim, it has two sides, the North American side and the Asian Russian side. And the Russian Far East extends from the Bering Sea, where it reaches east towards Alaska, all the way down to Japan and the Korean Peninsula. And it's a vast and really pristine and until, incredibly low population density that encompasses the same geography as Alaska, British Columbia, Oregon, and Washington. It's a mirror image of that on the other side of this vast ocean. And it also has 40% of the world's wild salmon, and actually a richer diversity of salmon species than we have.
It has 40% of the world's wild salmon population?
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah. So you can't save wild salmon and the North Pacific ecosystem without working with Russia and Canada and Japan. And so there was a bilateral treaty called Area 5. But before I do that, I went over as soon as we could and was one of the first Americans there. And I was introduced to a Russian scientist named Mikhail Skopets, who is a real hero, like a explorer, fish scientist, discovered many new species, passionate angler, and just disappears by himself into the wilderness. I flew over and went to Kamchatka, and that opened up an area of 20 years of with the Russian scientists exploring the rivers of Kamchatka and the Russian Far East. And so Kamchatka is a giant peninsula the size of California that extends south from the Russian mainland into the Pacific. It's got 30 active volcanoes. There's 300 volcanoes in total on it, almost no roads. And it sits on the edge of the Asian and North American tectonic plate. So there's a subduction zone there that causes a lot of volcanic activity. I mean, I've flown into Kamchatka and smelt the sulfur from volcanoes erupting in the commercial airplane. It's just strange. But it is so beautiful. The rivers are made for salmon. There's the horizon are these perfect volcanoes. The foothills are forested in the fall. It's just a spectacular place with an incredible abundance of brown bears and some of the biggest brown bears in the world, and these giant eagles called harpy eagles. So we explored Kamchatka and did expeditions on many of those rivers with Russian scientists. And then later, I really took a deep dive into across the Sea of Okhotsk, which is a big sea that's to the west of Kamchatka, and then the Russian mainland. North of Vladivostok and Khabarovsk is a whole area that's home to the giant taimen, which is an enormous Asian trout, which I can also tell you about, but I'm getting ahead of myself.
Let's get some more context or get some more content on the Kamchatka, because this ties in with your salmon stronghold.
Yes.
What would you call that? An initiative?
No, it's a strategy. So let me just define the strongholds, and then I'll describe their implementation in Russia. So I went to Russia, and Pete Sovrel, who's a dear colleague and the founder of the Wild Salmon Centre, he and I met in the 90s, and I went to work with Pete and became his first executive director and built up the organization. But Pete pioneered steelhead fishing in Kamchatka. He's since left the Wild Salmon Centre and has his own organization called the Conservation Angler that led expeditions to fish for steelhead, terrific steelhead fishing. So my professional focus in conservation has been really focused on one big idea, that as part of any global strategy to protect salmon, we need to protect and proactively protect the last healthy or relatively healthy salmon rivers in each ecological region of the North Pacific. Because the threats that have destroyed so many other rivers will come inevitably, even for the ones that are as pristine as we think of they're going to always be that way. Well, they won't, because the pressures for gold mining and dam building and logging and fishing are going to double and quadruple, over, it's supposed to basically double. I mean, the projections are the growing human economies are going to overtake all of these rivers, and it'll be one big threat after another. So the big idea is, can we get to a system and protect it proactively so that when those threats come, we can prevent them from happening? And the basic idea is it's easier to prevent a dam from being built than it is to take one out, once it's there. And once a big industrial mine is there, that impact has been perpetuity. So I'm not saying we need to recover as many rivers as we can. We need to take as many dams out strategically as it makes sense. But any strategy should have a stronghold strategy that says, this river, we're not going to let anything bad happen to it forever. But there has to be, in this broader strategy, an effort to prevent the last good rivers from being damaged. And that's what the stronghold strategy is. But it doesn't mean that the other rivers are unimportant. It just means that this is a piece of any broad strategy to save wild salmon. The stronghold strategy is built on this idea that can we protect huge watersheds? I mean, some of these Alaska rivers, I mean, they're just of the Skeena in British Columbia is the size of Switzerland. So can we set these aside and protect them? So I spent my entire career working in Russia and Alaska and British Columbia and Oregon and Washington to with scientists to find these rivers in each area and supporting the local partners in each region to say, this is a gift. Now, you look at Europe, frankly, or the East Coast of the United States or California, where we
Hmm.
raced to dam and destroy every. Imagine if we'd gone back in time and said, pick a river and just said, let's leave this one alone. Now, you really can't do that now because all these rivers have been carved up into pieces, or most of them, right? Most of them.
Yeah.
But in Russia, you have a landscape that extends off. We'd fly helicopters all day, Mi-8. That's the only way to travel over there is by Russian helicopter, Mi-8 helicopters, and not see one road. So we can still do that in Russia. And so I worked with the Russians as a representative. I had the United Nations Development Program hired me as a salmon expert. And I said, made the case to them that we have so screwed up our rivers that once were as beautiful and miraculous as your rivers. And now we're spending hundreds, billions of dollars trying to bring the salmon back with mixed results. It's not really, there's some bright spots, but we wish we wish we would have gone back in time and set aside some of these rivers too. And the Russians are really impressive, passionate, highly educated scientists. I mean, they put science above everything. And we built trust with the Russians and helped support local organizations and would helicopter into these watersheds to document the biological diversity and the condition of the river. And they embraced the stronghold strategy because it was fundamental. I wouldn't say they saw it as our strategy. They just said it makes sense because they have one of the oldest park systems in the world. And with the Russians, shoulder to shoulder, with us supporting them, providing the best lessons learned from across the Pacific Rim, emphasizing that they might do a better job than us, frankly, than we did. We would go into rivers and work with them and add them to Russia's protected area network called Zakazniks. There's Zakazniks and Zapovietniks. And we did that 8 times. And we're very privileged to work in close partnership with the Russians. And they still are protecting those rivers. And we did a lot of other things to do with anti-poaching and certifying marine fisheries and supporting local organizations that, I could go on and on, but I will say that I'm quite proud of the work in Russia and of my Russian colleagues. And that chapter was just, the curtains opened. We came in the beginning, flying around in these Mi-8 helicopters, seeing rivers that had never been fished with endless mysteries. And it was just absolutely incredible.
So it sounds like if we're going to carve the last 100, maybe 200 years as a particular epoch in time, sociopolitically, and for the majority of that time, the East and the West don't see eye to eye, should we say. And you had a brief window where you could freely work with these, what sound like incredibly talented and proactive scientists. You were introduced to some of the wildest, most pristine catchments that the world has to offer when it comes to salmon. And you went in there and you ring fenced them and proved that they need to be ring fenced and they shouldn't be messed with and they should be purely kept as is for the sake of the wild fish and obviously the ecosystem that hangs off the back of that. And then, of course, in recent years, I'm guessing that opportunity, that they've closed the door on that again. Do you know how those rivers are faring, if they are still strongholds for salmon?
Oh, no, they'll always be strongholds for salmon. I mean, that's our mission. What happened in Russia was, well, I mean, we worked with the Russian scientists. We learned from them. They learned from us. We brought the Russians over here. They met with the Alaskans, the Canadians. They brought back technology and ideas. Some of the Russians are always looking at me and thinking, oh, come on, you're not coming all the way over here and doing all this for the salmon. There's got to be some other plan. But most of them understood that, that I'm obviously my goal is to protect salmon ecosystems, full stop. So things are holding together over there so far, knock on wood. But Russia designated the Wild Salmon Centre in 2023 as an undesirable organization, kind of closing the door to our work in Russia. What that means is it's illegal for the Russians to work with us. And this was a byproduct of the geopolitical conflict in Ukraine. Other organizations have got this. The World Wildlife Fund received the same designation. So we put a hold on our Russian work, and I just have had to suspend our communications with our Russian colleagues for the time being. But I think the outcomes are durable. I have to tell one more Russian story, though, the most incredible one for any angler. Can I just touch on that, on the Tugur and the giant taimen? So we started hearing rumors, and my close friend, Dr. Mikhail Skopets, who's published his own books, including the book on fly fishing in the Russian Far East, by the way, he said, Guido, there's a river over here that has a race of taimen. Now, taimen are a genus within the salmon family. They're just a giant Asian trout. And of course, in Europe, you've got the huchen, and then there's the Siberian taimen that extend all the way across Mongolia and the Russian Far East. And then actually there's some very ancient and strange taimen in the Sea of Japan called a sea run taimen, called it's a genus is called Parahucho, but they're get to be 70 pounds and they eat, I mean, they're a tremendous species. They look like a sea run brown. Only a few Westerners have caught them. And then there's also an isolated population of taimen, a whole new species in North Korea, and then another one in the headwaters of the Yangtze River in China. So there's some work to do among us obsessed fishermen for our life list. But so Skopet said, Guido, there's a race of taimen in this river called the Tugur, which flows from the forested landscape of the Russian Far East. So just visualize south of Siberia, north of Vladivostok and Khabarovsk, south of the Amur, or north of the Amur. It's a vast landscape that looks very much like Alaska or boreal Canada. And Skopet said, Guido, there's taimen there that get big enough to feed on adult salmon. I'm like, you mean as adult? So these taimen feed on full-grown chum salmon. And they're giant. They get up to be apparently 100 pounds in size. So so it's a 100-pound trout we're talking about. And nobody had really fly fished for them. And so Skopets and I started exploring the Tugur, and the prime lease, there was a powerful Russian sport fisherman who bought the lease from one of our friends. His name is Alexander Abramov. He's a very powerful businessman and a mathematician. He was a graduate of this elite physics institute, became a very successful businessman, and he's a crazy taimen fisherman. So he built camps on the Tugur, and they had a poaching problem with illegal fishing. And this happened all over the Russian Far East in the 90s, that people were harvesting vast amounts of salmon, killing all the fish, and then stripping the females for their roe to use for a kura. And this was an existential, I wouldn't say existential, but the major threat to Russian salmon for years. Now they've kind of turned the corner on that. But Alexander had poachers at one point on every gravel bar of the Tugur catching the chum salmon that the taimen ate. And so he basically worked with the local government and created his own, I wouldn't say military unit, but enforcement. And he chased the poachers off the Tugur, and he did it. And I think it's terrific. And now the Tugur is saved. It's protected. We worked with Khabarovsk Wildlife Foundation and others to help create a protected area. And now the Tugur watershed is now a big park, which is fantastic. But the taimen, so now as an angler, right, not as a professional, but an angler, Skopets and I, and another colleague named Ilya Sherbovich, he has the camps on the Pinoy. We all went to the Tugur because we knew that understanding how to fly fish for these taimen is one of the great fly fishing challenges. You know, will they take a fly? What would we do with a 100-pound taimen? And we went back again and again, exploring the river, tying different patterns, trying to figure out what they were feeding on. Obviously, we couldn't take a fly the size of a salmon, but we found the taimen love grayling and lennox, which is an Asian trout. And during the hatches, those grayling and lennox would be feeding near the surface, and then now and again you'd see this whoosh with a tail, you know, that big. And we gradually learned how to catch these taimen. My biggest was 84 pounds. And And they're beautiful fish, but you only catch one or two a day, or so it's like elk hunting. I mean, maybe you have a chance every 2 days. They're not a lot, but and then Skopets learned how to catch them too. But then Ilya Sherbovich became the Timon fly fishing king, and he really learned how to catch those, and he's caught multiple fish over 100 pounds. So Ilya and I, we were all fishing it together, kind of in a good-natured way, trying to see who could break 100 pounds. And then we got designated as undesirable. So now Ilya has the whole river to himself, and I'm quite jealous of that. But
is that how they all fish for them out there?
No. So really, Ilya Sherbovich, Mikhail Skopets, and I really pioneered fly fishing for Timon in the Tagore. And there's a watershed to the north that my last trip over there, we were exploring this one with, stories of and a few pictures of fish that, are so big that you really need two people to hold them out of the water. And so the Russians use they don't use big plugs. They're like Rapala type plugs with what they use extra heavy trebles. And they cast and they pound the daylights out of these pools. And now I think we know that the pool is their living room or their bedroom, but their kitchen is above and below in the big fast water flats or the big tailouts. Gradually, we also learned that they will take a foam waking fly. And when that happens, when you're, what it's like with dries, you're fishing again and swinging it and popping it. And you're like, there's no fish here. It's been all day. And then all of a sudden, just boom, out comes one of these fish.
I urge listeners to find this film online. What is it called, Guido? Just remind us what it's called and where they can find it.
It's called River Tigers. There's a link on our website, wildsalmoncenter.com.
Back to the smaller salmonids, the ones that us mere mortals have, if we're lucky, the options to try and catch. Hatcheries. Now, I know, just as is the case in Europe and the North Atlantic basin, on the Pacific Rim and the rivers that the salmon run there, hatcheries are used on various rivers, on various river systems to less or greater results. What are your thoughts on hatcheries? They're very contentious over here, but with the Atlantic salmon stock certainly hanging by a thread as it is, we are exploring all options to try and keep certain stocks sustainable on certain rivers. What are your thoughts on hatcheries over there on the Pacific?
Yeah, I want to be careful here because I'm not an expert on Atlantic salmon, but I am an expert on Pacific salmon. So hatcheries, what happened to us is we basically destroyed the habitat, built dams across the rivers, and thought, well, we can just replace these fish by building a fish hatchery where the fish come in, we strip them of their eggs, and we release the juveniles. Sure, that did create more fish in some systems below the dams, but it got to the point where we just kept introducing more and more salmon into the system, and fewer were coming back. And simultaneously, we noticed that the wild fish began to dwindle. Here's what we learned. Hatcheries need to be understood in the context of what your goal is for the river. If the goal is to have strong wild runs and have fish that can survive the changes in climate and weather and adapt to all the different changes in that system over hundreds of years, you need wild fish. Mm-hmm. Hatchery fish do adapt, but what happened with the hatchery fish is, as the founding brood stock for these hatcheries, we didn't understand that each run of salmon is not a run of salmon, but it's many small genetically distinct populations that are going to different parts of the watershed. That's called the genetic diversity. And same thing was true of the Atlantic salmon. So you have the ones that jump the waterfalls and the headwaters, and they've got extra jumping abilities, and others spawn in the lower river and so on. Each one of those, and as time goes by, the different ones do better or worse as the environment changes, but they all average out to a lot of fish. Okay. So when you take a hatchery run and you put in one piece of that and flood the system with genetically a very narrow bandwidth, which is what happened, you do two things. One is, when those fish come back and spawn with all the rest of the fish, they dramatically dilute the gene pool and they water down that genetic diversity. So a healthy wild salmon population is like a key, and all those runs are teeth on the key, and the river is the lock. And you just knock off keys until you're down to very little. And this is what's happened on the Sacramento River in California and in the Columbia, all over the Pacific Northwest, where we just stripped the genetic diversity out of the population. Now we know that genetic diversity is everything, because these fish make these very fine-tuned adaptations to come in and out and live with the habitat. So what we've ended up with is most of our salmon are listed for protection under the Endangered Species Act. If the hatchery system worked, we'd be swimming in salmon. But so the problem with hatcheries is they genetically erode the fish. They compete ecologically with those fish. So they're bad for wild fish in that river. Now, you can use hatcheries as a conservation tool as long as they're bounded in time. If you use a hatchery to try to get a fish population back to a certain level, to prevent it from being extinct, and then reintroduce it or protect it from extinction, that's a conservation hatchery. But the one key issue is then it has to close. Otherwise, you're on this system that you just can't wean yourself off of. And so it's very hard to get hatcheries out once they're in. Now, in the Pacific Northwest, there's some rivers that they've invested in hatcheries.
Mm-hmm.
And we've said, great, let that be a hatchery river. Others are managed for salmon biodiversity. As a conservationist, I'm not a proponent of hatcheries, but as a realist in the Pacific Northwest, I know that some people need a chance to catch a fish. If the goal is to recover wild Atlantic salmon, hatcheries will not do it. They don't work. If the goal is to prevent a race from being extinct until the habitat and the virtuous cycle can get it going again, that's a good use. But I don't want to opine on the proliferation of hatcheries in the Atlantic salmon context. I just don't know that landscape as well.
Could you have them side by side? I mean, are there enough rivers left that haven't been degraded or compromised where you could run salmon strongholds alongside rivers with hatcheries and expect it to be beneficial or mutually beneficial, should I say?
Well, there's a lot of straying. That's an issue. But in the strongholds, some have hatchery systems in there, but they're small. Scale matters with hatcheries. And so we've tried to not wage a war against the hatchery system because we're just saying some rivers need to be for wild fish. Just to put that in context, Washington State, every single river has a hatchery on it. They're swimming in hatchery fish and their runs are in crisis. And they keep juicing the hatchery machine to get more fish. And it's like, Oregon's better. About half of our coastal rivers are being managed for wild fish now. So there's a portfolio that seems to be working okay for us right now. And some of my colleagues may argue with that.
That's interesting. That's really interesting. We touched upon this with fisheries scientist Ken Whelan, who I think you know in season 1, and he was echoing much what you say. It depends what you want from your rivers, fundamentally speaking.
Yes.
And I think if we're here to save the wild salmon, and the millions of years that it's taken to evolve and that gene strain and that DNA, then I think I can hear you. I can hear what you're saying with regards to hatcheries. In Europe, what can we learn from your expertise, Guido? I appreciate the caveat is you are not an Atlantic salmon expert per se, but in the same breath, what you don't know about Pacific salmon isn't worth knowing, and I'm sure there's huge crossover between the two species. So what can we learn from you?
I would say what we have learned, which is that the quality of the habitat in a river system is critical. So that means cold water all summer long and lots of off-channel, marshy, swampy, little side eddies, that create biological productivity in a watershed. So if you strip that by stripping the riparian vegetation down or draining that, you just reduce the biological productivity of that river. And that's important for the salmon because for species like Atlantic salmon that have multiple year freshwater life histories, how big they are when they get to the ocean is a major determinant of survival. So restoring and adding habitat back worked really well in the Pacific Northwest. I mean, I've had people opening up these wetlands and had coho salmon literally migrating into them from the main channel. So the big, fast-moving brook is not as, as productive as the off-channel habitat. So habitat's one. Protect what you have. Make sure you're protecting cold water, in-stream flow, and build that piece by piece. The second is manage for genetic and life history diversity. This is the genetic and epigenetic triggers that differentiate all these little populations. And we're now realizing that is everything. It's like a stock portfolio. You don't want to have all your stock in one company. You want to hedge your bets. Same with the salmon run in any given river. The early race, the early run, which are often the big fish, the middle, the fall, the different life histories, that's your indicator, and that's what you're managing for. So those were two things that we took.
That's really interesting, and certainly marries with the work that I'm involved with or I read about, which is restoration, which absolutely habitat restoration. And if we can make these salmon rivers smolt factory, industrial machines, for want of a better expression, but just to use that analogy, to create habitat enough so that we can give those juvenile salmon the best chance to get as big and as strong and as many as possible, then that's going to help with whatever it is that's compromising them out at sea for sure. And I think that's reassuring to hear you're advising that from all the way over there. So thank you for that, Guido. Before we move on to our final three questions, I just want to talk to you a little bit about the Trump presidency. There's a lot of fear, I think, with regards to conservation and how maybe this next 4 years isn't going to be the brightest when it comes to the environment, should we say. Being an American, what can you say about that?
Well, let me say two things. I don't know if I mentioned earlier in the podcast, but our organization is establishing strongholds across the North Pacific that will be durable in 100 years. That the whole network extends over 100 million acres of habitat, but it's not turning every river into a park, but we basically learned how to protect these watersheds by protecting the habitat, managing the wild fish for genetic diversity, and then supporting a local group or creating a local group to defend that river. And that we call that the durability threshold. When those three pieces are in place, and we're up to about 35 million acres protected, thousands of river miles, and we have a good track record, and we know how to do this. And so our view is we're not getting distracted from anything outside of these rivers. We are never, ever going to give up on their protection. We have fought battles against gold mining, hydroelectric dams, clear-cut logging, poaching, fish farms, and knock on wood, we've won every single battle. There's been no significant degradation to the stronghold, so we know we can do it. Our goal is by 2032 to have the network at the durability threshold with a permanent fund that will endow it. And we're well on our way. I think we'll get there. But to do that, it means that our value proposition is simple. Our species will be enriched and our children will be grateful if we can deliver some of these rivers to their future in each part of the Pacific Rim. And that's a message that a Republican and a Democrat can share. And so our board are half Republicans and half Democrats. Some of our most important supporters are Republicans who have as deep a passion for conservation as I do. And so we just keep the political stuff out of the organizational dialogue, and we all just agree to disagree on who's the president. I can't even tell you how things are so polarized right now. I've never seen anything like it.
I bet.
It's a tragedy. I mean, I grew up in a family where my father was a Republican and my mother was a Democrat, and they argued at the dinner table every night politely and gave each other, a little elbow to the ribs and a little smile. And it wasn't as vitriolic and win-lose. But so then that you asked the question, how will Trump be for the environment?
Yeah.
Most people think it'll be pretty bad for the environment.
Mm-hmm.
That's the general consensus among conservation groups, like quite bad, could be quite bad. We were, during the first Trump administration, Donald Trump was ready to, not him personally, but his administration was going to permit a gold mine in the headwaters of Bristol Bay, Alaska.
That's right.
And this mine would be an existential threat to the most productive salmon rivers in the world. And with the help of the Vice President Mike Pence's former chief of staff, Nick Ayers, Nick and Donald Trump Jr. completely re-educated the White House, got them to realize how important the system was, and agreed to protect Bristol Bay, and thus moving the Alaska delegation towards the same goal and deny the permit. And it was extraordinary, and it gave real durability to the cause, because you don't want it to whipsaw during one administration, then it gets back into a Republican administration, and they go backwards. Now we've got a Republican and Democratic administration that say, this place is too precious. So I'm hoping and assuming that we can maintain the antipathy of the Trump administration to mining in Bristol Bay. And I'm hopeful that we can work with them on saving some of these places. I'm not going to be so cavalier as to say to be able to predict what's going to happen, but we can work with the Republicans and we can work with the Democrats. I think it's a critical part of the equation.
The salmon is a very political fish, certainly the Atlantic salmon over here, and has been increasingly used as it's divisive because it's just been classed as endangered in the UK. We are actually trying to use that politics to the benefit of the fish, but what I'm hearing is the work that you've done has been so robust and so brilliantly received and fruitful in its results that politics isn't too much of a concern. You have hope that the right people will see what's right and will make the right decisions. And that's heartening to hear. So thank you.
We're in this for 100 years. We're strong enough to weather either swing on the political spectrum. You just have to say, I will never stop fighting for these rivers with the local people that care about them. Full stop.
I will never stop fighting for these rivers. I think if you abide by that manifesto, that mantra, I think nothing else matters really. I think you stick to that, and that's going to get you some way. That's going to bring us neatly into our final three questions, Guido. If you had $1 billion to help save wild salmon, how would you spend it?
You know, what I would do is set up a permanent fund. So invest it and manage it like a foundation. And with the annual grants, give grants to each of those local groups on the Stronghold rivers or in the Atlantic salmon context. And, $50,000, $100,000 a year goes a long way on these local groups. And with that money, I would connect them with the other groups so they can learn from each other and professionalize. In the end of the day, the people that live in a river watershed or the First Nations that live there will fight the hardest to protect that place. And we see those local groups as like an immune response. So a river is a living thing, and the North Pacific is a vast ecosystem we share. And you don't want to sever that river from the ocean and its salmon, which are like the red blood cells. So the local groups are key. So that's what I would do. I'd create a permanent fund to provide perpetual funding to pay for a percentage of the annual operating cost for the diaspora of conservation groups, all the way from the Sarufutsu River in Hokkaido, Japan, up to the Russian Far East and all the way down to Butte Creek in the Sacramento. And I think that would work to defend those systems.
That's great. So it's operational costs, which is interesting. You wouldn't ring fence it for particular causes. You just want to keep those NGOs, those communities, those passionate people. You want to keep them going. That's all you want to do, because they will do the right thing if they're sustained.
You want them to be an effective immune response. You want them to know how to build a board. You want them to know how to raise money, leverage government grants, understand the local politics, build power maps and figure out what's it going to take, and be ready when some Canadian mining company goes down and said, we just discovered a lot of gold in the headwaters of the, Kvichak River in Alaska. And they've got to come out like army ants, just boiling out of there and going after those adversaries. And it works.
Yeah.
It's worked again and again.
That's brilliant. That's fantastic advice. If you had no money, conversely, what would you do to help save the salmon?
I'm very much a believer in the relationship between an angler and his or her river. And that's your home water. And I know you have your home water it's where you make yourself whole again and connect to nature, which is increasingly hard to do in today's world, especially our children. My gosh, we need to make sure they have that connection. Mm-hmm. And so I would say I just love my river. I understand it. And a part of my life is going to be preventing bad things from happening to it. And the feeling I'll have as an old man or woman drinking bourbon by the side of the river and knowing that my kids and grandkids might fish some of the same rivers or some riffles, that means a lot.
Okay, that's great. So fishing, angling, perfect. I love it. And speaking of which, it's your last day on Earth and you get to spend it fishing. Where would you go and who would it be with?
That's a really tough one. For me, it would be the Dean River in British Columbia.
I've fished the Dean.
You have?
Yep. I fished the Dean. I fished the Lower Copper for the Steelies up in Terrace. Yeah, absolutely. But I'm jumping in on your answer. So sorry, I just had to say because I had a wonderful time there.
So the Dean is a beautiful river that flows out of a valley that was carved by the glacier. Central British Columbia, flows into the ocean, no dams. It's completely pristine. The walls are 3,000 feet of solid rock on either side of you with old growth forest. And it was carved by this huge glacier during the Pleistocene glaciation. So it's got that look. The river is alluvial, meaning it goes sideways over gravel, hits the rock wall, there'll be a pool. It's clear. It's got a healthy race of summer steelhead that come in 8 months before they spawn. So imagine how much lipids they have in their flesh and how powerful they are. I've had Dean River steelhead jump over the level of my head multiple times after taking it dry, taking the rod out of your hands. It's beautiful. It's healthy. It's a spectacular river. I just love that river. My wife, Lee, and I have 3 boys, and they're all college age or just graduated. And we fish together all the time and hunt. And my dream is I'd like to take Lee and the boys there. That's my dream.
So fishing the Dean in central British Columbia for steelhead with your boys. What a wonderful thing that would be. And I'm sure you will make that happen. You've made so much happen for the salmon. They owe you. So I'm sure that will happen. Thank you so much, my friend. That was, we're very lucky we get to talk a lot about our passion, which is the Atlantic salmon and angling for it and the conservation of it. And we're incredibly lucky to have you on. And I know that this is going to be a really, really, really cherished episode.
I appreciate being on. And someday, you and me on the Itchen.
Absolutely. The invitation is open. You're welcome to come and fish for trout, grayling, and we could have a go for the elusive chalkstream salmon anytime you're over here, Guido.
Love to. Thank you.
My thanks to Guido Rahr for joining me. And on the next episode of The Last Salmon, it could perhaps be called the Canadian Yvonne Chouinard, someone who has committed their life to living the outdoors while running a successful business. And like Patagonia's founder, Fred Campbell is someone truly obsessed with protecting nature and the wild salmon.
Could we create this time machine where we go back in time where human beings were truly connected to the nature and not intelligent enough to destroy it?
And you'll also find out about the places in the Canadian North where double-figure salmon are common and their numbers are still healthy.
And when he hooked into that fish and I saw it, I was like, wow, that's amazing. And he showed me it and I got the chance to catch one. And that was the first time it really sparked inside of me.
Listen and follow The Last Salmon on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And remember to keep in the fight for our salmon. The Last Salmon Season 2 is supported by the Missing Salmon Alliance.